Hey guys, welcome to today's video. My name is Vienna Light and I am your local real estate expert in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Today we are going to be talking about something where I feel like there may be some confusion in the fact that closing a home is not as straightforward as a lot of people think it is. Now you would think that, okay, I signed the papers, signed the house over, and we're done. It's not that simple like it is simple just buying a t-shirt from the mall or something, or online shopping. It's not like you can just click a button and then they process the payment right away and then you have your thing. And it's like, you would think that it should be that easy, but at the same time, it should not, because it is a really big purchase that anyone is doing when it comes to owning or selling a home. And so today we are going to be talking about specifically the difference between closing versus funding versus dispersing. And all of those things that could easily get confused with each other. And really, they all represent a specific part of the closing process in order for the seller to get their money and for the buyer to successfully buy the home. And so we're going to be discussing the differences between these three terms today, so that for my sellers out there, it is important to know on when in that scenario you get your money from selling your home. And for buyers, it's important to know when you're able to get the keys for your home and you officially own it. So that is what we're going to be discussing. And so if you're interested in that, then go ahead and keep on watching. With the differences between closing, funding, and dispersing, it really comes down to how many people and how many parts are handled during the housing transaction process. And so, like I mentioned before in an earlier example about it not being as easy as just purchasing an item at a store, when you are buying a house, you know that there are other factors into making the transaction successful. And in order to make the transaction of a house successful, you have to go through lending and you have to go through the title company. So the title company, if you do not know, the easy TLDR version of describing what a title does, is basically the transfer of ownership and acting as the middleman of a housing transaction. And of course, lending, if you were getting a loan out and you're not buying this house in cash, for example, then that also goes into play. When all of that is going in on helping you process the housing transaction, you can only imagine that it'll take a couple extra steps. At the end of the housing transaction process is closing. So closing basically means that the buyer and the seller parties have signed the documents to do the transaction. So that is just going over the documents with title and making sure that both parties understand what they are signing when they are essentially selling or buying the house. And so closing only happens and only is defined when both parties have signed documentation. Now, no money has been handled at this point yet. Then comes funding. And so funding is after you sign those documents have to be given back to the lender to give them the okay that yes, both parties have done so, have done the signing of the documents, it is official. So now the lending side of things will then give those funds to title. And so that is basically an okay that, okay, both parties agreed to what they signed. Now we can bring the money into play as part of the closing. So this is usually why when you close, for my buyers out there, you do not receive the keys yet, because none of the money has been given to title for the next step. And so funding basically means that the money from the lending side of things is then touched and then transferred over to title. So then the final step is that title receives those funds. Now they are able to disperse those funds, aka the last step being dispersing. And so when you disperse funds, that basically means at this point that the seller gets their money for the house, and now officially the buyers own the house because they bought the house with the money that they got from their lender. It sounds super simple and just like very self-explanatory and just like so many extra steps, but really that explains a lot of things that I hear from buyers and sellers, which is the most common question being with sellers, when am I going to get my funds? Why is it going to take so long? All of that stuff, versus the buyers on why can't I have the keys right now? And when am I able to start moving in? And sellers, of course, moving out and all of that stuff. And so that's the reason why when you sign the documents, that typically doesn't mean that the housing transaction is done. Just know that there are extra steps, a couple extra steps after that to consider when you are closing on a house and doing the housing transaction. So just know that in the funding process, once the money is okayed, that's typically when the buyer receives the keys, and then at disbursement, the seller will receive the funds. How long should we be expecting for these steps to take place? So of course, with closing, signing the documents, that is of course happening right away at whatever time that title and the buyers and sellers have planned to sign off the documentation. Now, depending on when those documents get signed, will also depend on how long it'll take to get funding. That is determined based on the lender. If you're signing closer to the afternoon, which usually that doesn't happen, I've only had closings in the morning, so that funding could happen same day, so the buyers can get the house that day if possible. But of course, later in the day, and depending on the lender, it could depend on that and could even follow through to the next day. And that's the same with sellers receiving their monetary amount and their money for selling the house. So if, say, it takes longer for the funding to happen and that doesn't happen until in the late afternoon, and now all the businesses, aka title, is closed at that point, then seller may not receive their funds until the following day. But of course, vice versa can happen, where if closing and funding happen earlier in the day, then more than likely the seller would receive their funds later that day. The closing process itself usually happens at the most 2 days. I have heard some things regarding some special funding scenarios where it's cash, or where funding takes a little longer for ABC reasons, and so maybe it'll take longer. But just rest assured that if the funding does not happen for whatever reason, and even though both parties sign papers, it does not mean that now the seller's without a house and the buyer just takes the house without paying for it. That just does not happen. If you don't get the money happening and circulating correctly through title, then the actual transaction just does not happen. That's all it really means. It's not anything to fret about or to get scared about, but that is a super rare scenario, because I would like to think that buyers want to buy a house, sellers want to sell their house in the ideal scenario, right? And so that is the difference between all these three terms and why there may be some delays on essentially owning a house and getting funds for selling a house. And so these extra steps are very important so that all the way through to the end of the housing transaction, everything is accounted for, and that we all as real estate professionals and people in the real estate industry are doing our job to make sure that everything is clear and ready to go for both parties. So if you guys like this sort of content and would like to see more real estate content just like this one, then go ahead and leave a like and subscribe. I upload videos like this every single week, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!